start, the threats are rook takes rook, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes rook, check. Knight takes rook. Queen to c8, check. King to g7. Queen takes knight. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook to b8, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes knight. Queen takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes queen. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen to h3, check. Queen to g2, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to d3, check. The puzzle is solved using queen takes queen. Rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Another one, the threats are rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to d5, check. Rook to a4, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to a4, check. King to e5. Rook takes rook. d7. King to e7. Promotes to rook. King takes rook. Next, the threats are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Here are the checks. Queen to c5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h4, check. Queen takes knight, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to f7, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen takes pawn, check. King to e6. Rook takes pawn, checkmate. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is bishop to g3. Knight to d3. Pawn takes pawn. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen to h1, check. Queen to d3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to d3, check. King to g1. Queen takes rook. One more, the threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to d3. King to f2. King to d2. Another puzzle, the threats are rook takes rook. The checks are rook to f5, check. Rook to e3, check. The answer is rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. King to f6. King to e4. King to e6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn. The checks are queen to e5, check. Queen to c7, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to f8, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to d4, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to d4, check. Queen takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to c5, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop to c5, check. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to h3, h6. Queen takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is rook to f1, e2. Rook to f4, checkmate. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes rook. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes rook. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are rook to h6, check. Rook to d4, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to h6, check. King takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle, the threats are queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to b4, check. Queen to a5, check. Bishop to d2, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to b4, check. c3. Queen takes knight. Next, here are the threats. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. King takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is king takes bishop. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Next, the threats are rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen to h8, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to e8, check. Rook to h3, check. Rook to h1, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to h1, check. King to g6. Rook to h6, checkmate. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to c4. Knight to d6, check. King to d5. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are rook to e3, check. Rook to g2, check. The answer is rook to e3, check. King to f2. Promotes to queen. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Knight to h3, check. Knight to e2, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Bishop to e2. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. One more. Threats in puzzle position are king takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes rook, check. Answer to this puzzle is king takes pawn. King to e3. Rook takes rook, check. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to f5, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to d8. Queen to g1, check. King to a2. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are rook to b3, check. Rook to f1, check. The puzzle is solved using b3. Rook to c8, check. King to h7. Rook to c1. Rook takes rook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.